We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here for the final time in 2020 at the Apex for UFC Vegas 17. This event will be the 25th event in a row, so it has been a long marathon since summer, back on July the 12th. Credit where credit is due though, if it wasn't for Dana White and the UFC, we really wouldn't have had much MMA this year due to COVID-19, so I'm really grateful for that. But moving back onto this event, unfortunately we lost the headlining fight between Leon Edwards versus Khamzat Chimaev, which was the fight I was looking forward to the most during the last stretch of this year. We also lost Alexandre Pantoja versus Manel Kape, Misha Cirkunov versus Ryan Spann, and then yesterday we lost Bilal Muhammad versus Diego Lima. So the card has taken hits already, and I expect there'll be a couple more with the card being stacked with 14 fights. However, of course, we have a new headline fight with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Geoff Neal though, and I'm super happy that Neal is finally headlining an event. It really couldn't have happened to a more humble and deserving up-and-coming fighter, so I'm really looking forward to that fight. I do think it's still a really good main event. But just before we get into the breakdowns, last Saturday night was another good night overall at MMAPlay365. There was only one official bet with Rafael Fiziev, who knocked out Renato Moicano in a fight that I broke down very accurately. The dog of the week was Gavin Tucker, who won dominantly, so that was an easy package purchase for just $4.99. We did drop with Tony Ferguson as a recommended betting option, along with a couple of our parlay pieces though, but all in all, a very happy weekend. It's also worth mentioning here that from the last 15 UFC events, our official bets at MMAPlay365 have only had 2 losing events, and that dates back to the start of September too. So the run of form right now is solid leading into the exit of 2020. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too. So to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event. We've got Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Geoff Neal. Geoff Neal is currently the minus 120 favourite, with the comeback on Wonderboy at plus 100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the value sits with the underdog in Wonderboy. I simply just don't think that he should be an underdog in this spot. I do think he should be a favourite, but I'm also happy that Geoff Neal isn't being disrespected on the betting lines either. Minus 120, no disrespect there, and rightly so. Geoff Neal's a solid fighter, and we'll get into him very soon. As for where the betting lines move, closer to Fight Night on Saturday night, Wonderboy opened at minus 170 with Geoff Neal at plus 140. All the money's come back in on Geoff Neal, caused a line flip, and actually it's quite significant line movement from minus 170 to plus 100, so a lot of people are confident in Geoff Neal. I do think that current trend continues, but just not as great, so I can see more Geoff Neal money coming in, but I think it's only going to take Wonderboy getting to plus 110 or plus 115, and I think we'll start seeing that Wonderboy money coming in. Ultimately, come Fight Night on Saturday night, I just don't think the odds are going to be too dissimilar from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really interesting fight, and it almost has a feel of Wonderboy's last fight against Vicente Luque. I do feel there are some similarities between Luque and Neal. There are some subtle differences as well, which again I'll get into, but it does have that feel about it in regards to Luque being an absolute killer, getting that big step up to a fighter in Wonderboy that's got tons of experience, been in there 5 rounds against champions, one of the best strikers that we've ever seen in the UFC. So Luque got that step up. He was explosive, he was powerful, he was winning fights, exciting fights, he was getting everybody hyped, and that can pretty much describe Geoff Neal as well. Again, a really dangerous dude, knocking people out, scary inside the cage, everybody's hyped about him, a good up-and-comer, and just a solid fighter. So, like I say, a big step up for Neal, a big test for Neal, and we'll see how he does. But from Wonderboy's perspective, as I've already mentioned, one of the best strikers we've ever seen inside the UFC. He's as technical as they come. He's a fighter that's been able to stifle a lot of aggressive forward pressure fighters. And the 2 names that instantly spring to mind with this, again in his last fight against Vicente Luque, who is a fighter that'll get in your face, he'll put the pressure on you, he'll take one to land one, and and he'll ultimately try and knock you out at every opportunity. Wonderboy was able to just completely nullify Luque for the most part in that fight. He landed 138 strikes on him. By the end, he was dropping him, he was hurting him, and that was really surprising to see when you consider that Luque's a killer himself. And the other name that comes to mind is Jorge Masvidal. Wonderboy completely shut down Masvidal. He didn't let Masvidal get anything off on him, and he just controlled the fight from start to finish. Again, Masvidal is a fighter that likes to get in your face, ex-street fighter, so he's got that aura behind him in regards to, if you punch me, I'm just going to land back on you, it's fine, durable. But Masvidal was just not able to get his game going in that fight, and that's what Wonderboy does. He comes from that karate background, Kempo kickboxing. He'll have that sideways stance, he'll switch stances, he'll fight solid from both orthodox and southpaw. It's almost like a footballer who can play with both feet. You don't know which foot he's going to shoot with, cross a ball with. It's that similar sort of feel with Wonderboy as a fighter. He'll fight in both stances just as good as each other, and it's such a huge tool to have in your arsenal, being able to do that. So Wonderboy, very tricky to deal with, and his movement's also really elusive, sliding in and out of range at the right time. When he comes into range, he'll burst forwards with attacks and then slide back out of range before any danger can come back on his way. The one thing I will say is Wonderboy can be got at, and this is a real worry in this fight, because for Geoff Neal, I don't think Geoff Neal's going to out-volume Wonderboy. I don't think that he's going to be controlling the majority of the fight. Bear in mind, it's 5 rounds. We've not really seen Geoff Neal go 5 rounds in the UFC. He does look like he can slow down in fights as well. Nothing drastic, he doesn't gasp, but I just feel that over 5 rounds, the experience that Wonderboy's got should favour him in that respect. But going back to where Geoff Neal's going to be dangerous, Wonderboy can be got at, he can be cracked. Luque hit Wonderboy clean a few times, and some of those shots I was actually really surprised that Wonderboy took them and didn't go down, didn't wobble, didn't get hurt. But I said earlier that there's some subtle differences between Luque and Geoff Neal, and one of those differences is I think that Geoff Neal hits a lot harder than Luque. So what I'm trying to say is, if Wonderboy isn't defensively responsible in this fight and he gets hit with the same punches by Geoff Neal as what he did against Luque, I think Geoff Neal could knock him out for sure. Geoff Neal is explosive. The other subtle difference though, and again I come back to volume, is Luque generally does have more volume than Neal. He's more active, he doesn't take time off, he's constantly walking forwards, and that's where I think Geoff Neal's going to come unstuck in this fight. I think that he's going to have to get a read quickly on the kicks, on the stance switch from Wonderboy, on the way he fights, this karate style. He's going to have to make those reads early in the fight, because Wonderboy's style isn't something that's going to be easily replicated inside the gym with training partners. So Neal is definitely going to see something in this fight inside the cage on Saturday night that he's never dealt with before. I do think he has problems initially with the kicks. I think he will find himself down on the rounds, on the early rounds. If he makes the reads, then he could come back into the fight, but Geoff Neal has got to stay busy. He's got to constantly walk forward and try and get through that attack and defense of Wonderboy, because if he doesn't, and he does have moments where he's just trying to figure what's happening inside the cage and trying to get the reads, he's just going to keep getting clipped and clipped and clipped whilst he's making them reads before he's got a chance to come forward and start landing things himself. I actually think that from a style perspective, if Geoff Neal fought Luque, I think Geoff Neal would do bad things to Luque, but I think Luque's style is better to beat somebody like Wonderboy than what Geoff Neal's is. So from the positive side of Geoff Neal, he's got 5 rounds to try and land something on Wonderboy that's going to knock him out. And listen, Geoff Neal is definitely going to land punches on Wonderboy for as long as this fight goes on. We're not going to see 3 rounds, 4 rounds, 5 rounds of Wonderboy not getting clipped. Wonderboy is going to get clipped, so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when he does, because if one of those big punches from Neal or one of those big head kicks land on Wonderboy, then it could be good night for sure. But if Geoff Neal doesn't land that one clean flush shot that hurts Wonderboy and puts him away, basically not knocking him out, I do struggle to see Geoff Neal winning this fight on points. I just think the volume of Wonderboy, the elusivity, the experience, especially over 5 rounds, I think it's all pointing in the favour of Wonderboy. So if Geoff Neal doesn't knock him out, I think Wonderboy could either hurt him late or just take this fight on points. I think Wonderboy wins at least 3 of the 5 rounds, should it hit the scorecards. For those reasons, I'm picking Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to win this fight. And in the next fight, this one should be fighting fireworks. We've got Jose Aldo versus Marlon Vera. Jose Aldo is currently the minus 145 favourite. The comeback on Vera at plus 125 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the line's pretty fair, if I'm being honest. If I'm giving any marginal value, though, I'll probably sway it towards Jose Aldo. You know, it's a big step up for Marlon Vera, and Aldo's been in there with the best of the best, so marginal value on the betting line for Jose Aldo, in my opinion. As for where the betting lines move, I do think we see some fluctuation here. We've already seen Jose Aldo come from minus 160, minus 155 down to minus 145 and that sort of range. So there are clearly people out there that like Marlon Vera in this fight, and I don't totally disagree. You know, plus money on Marlon Vera is always going to be something that should be enticing because he will fight for your money, but I do think that we do see some fluctuation. There'll be a brick wall on Jose Aldo's line. I think if he gets down to minus 135, minus 130, at that point, I don't think it'll go any lower. I think we'll see the money coming back in on Aldo, pushing him to the minus 145, minus 150 range, and ultimately, I think that's where Jose Aldo's going to enter inside the cage on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out, though, it's a really, really good fight. Like I said, it's a big step up for Marlon Vera, and rightfully so, because he's been on an absolute tear. He's looked great lately. He did win that fight against Song Yadong, in my opinion, and I think the UFC rewarded him with that fight against Sean O'Malley, because if Vera didn't win that fight against Song Yadong, he doesn't get a fighter like Sean O'Malley after, who at the time was UFC's prospect, and it was a big step up from Song Yadong to fight Sean O'Malley, who again was on a tear himself. So for me, I don't look at that loss against Song Yadong too negatively. I think Marlon Vera was in a tough fight, a good fight, and a fight that he should have got the nod on the judges' scorecards. But you look at the run that Vera's been on, Luigi Bjorn, Guido Canetti, Frankie Sainz, Noeline Hernandez, Andre Ewell, Song Yadong. Then he takes out Sean O'Malley in one round after hurting his legs. So for me, it's a rightful step up for Marlon Vera, but I do think that he's going to have some difficulties in this fight against Aldo. One of the difficulties is the low kicks. That's assuming that Aldo goes back to these low kicks. It's been so long since we've seen Aldo fire the low kicks in. We've been talking about it every single podcast that, you know, Aldo needs to get back to those kicks. Those kicks are one of his biggest weapons. It's the weapon that he had most success with in his reign at featherweight. So for me, Aldo has got to get back to where he's strongest. And actually, against Yan, I bet Petr Yan in that fight, and I was surprised that Aldo came back with the kicks. You know, the one time I actually bet against Aldo and he starts throwing the kicks that he was so successful with over the years. Ultimately, Yan was able to get past that. It was a 5-round fight, and we know by now that Aldo struggles with 5-round fights going into those championship rounds. He's just not the same fighter as he is from rounds 1 to 3. This fight is a 3-round fight, so Aldo can let go a little bit more. And if he comes back with the kicks that he had against Petr Yan, then yeah, he's definitely going to cause Chito problems. It's really important though for Aldo here to try and just stop that forward pressure and aggression from Marlon Vera, because that's what Vera will want to do. You can't discourage this guy. You can't knock his confidence. You definitely can't break him. Whatever you hit him with, he's going to come back stronger. He's just a really tough fighter to wear down and to beat. But Aldo has got the weapons to handle that forward pressure and aggression. So when Chito's coming forward, I think it's important that Aldo just stings his legs or tags him and gets out of the way, especially early on. That'll just make Chito think twice when coming into range, because he'll know when he comes into range he's going to get tagged. That makes him a little more hesitant. When he becomes more hesitant, he becomes less aggressive. When he becomes less aggressive, that's when Aldo can push forward and start landing combinations on him. Aldo's got nice hands, really good boxing, throws in combinations, doesn't discriminate. He'll go to the body as well, to the head. So I think it's important for Aldo early to get Chito's respect, and that will allow Aldo to really open up in the fight, and I think that's where we see Aldo take over. The other side to mention in this fight is Chito, in a lot of his recent fights, especially in this run, has had significant grappling advantages over his opponent, where he can get on top, he can be dangerous, he can threaten submissions, or he can just control and land some ground and pound. I don't think that he's got those same advantages in this fight against Aldo. Aldo's jiu-jitsu is good. Also getting Aldo down is a tough enough task itself. I don't think Chito's wrestling is at the level to be able to take Aldo down at will. He may find himself on the mat in an opportunistic scenario. Maybe he drops Aldo, or maybe Aldo falls over or loses balance from a kick or an exchange or something like that. But I don't think that Chito can purposely get this fight to the mat, at least not very easily. So I don't think Chito has that advantages he's had in his previous fights. And again, it just flips me to think that Aldo is probably going to have a lot of success in this fight stylistically. I think the volume side could be close, but I think the longer this fight goes on, I think Aldo's experience comes into it. If Aldo uses the kicks as well, he'll start hurting the kicks of Chito. And I think if we see the fight go to the judges, because both guys are tough, so it could potentially go to the scorecards. I think the judges will see the majority of the fight, Aldo landing hard shots, the bigger action strikes, and potentially pushing Chito backwards towards the end of the fight in rounds 2 and 3 as well. So I do think Aldo is going to look better on the judges' scorecards, and I do think that it's a big step up for Chito, a rightful step up, but one that he's probably going to struggle with stylistically. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jose Aldo to win this fight. And in the next fight, this one's going to be absolutely nuts. I've already got a smile on my face before even breaking it down. We've got Michel Pereira versus Khaos Williams. Pereira is currently the -125 favourite. The comeback on Williams at +105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I would again say minimal value on Michel Pereira in my opinion, but the fight's going to be that crazy. It's going to be that unpredictable. Both fighters hit with power. Both fighters are elusive, specifically Pereira. It just wouldn't shock me if any of these fighters won. All it's going to take is one big shot or one big action, one big move, and the fight could be over. So that's why I'm saying minimal value on Pereira. If the fight didn't have that aura of unpredictability behind it, then I would say that Pereira was rightly -125 and could potentially be even wider too. But minimal value on Pereira as the betting line stands. And as the betting line moves, I do think we're going to see fluctuation. There does seem to be a lot of love on Pereira, and I do understand it. You know, there's still some questions on Khaos Williams, especially if the fight goes longer than 60 seconds. What does he look like? That's how crazy this guy's been inside the UFC. So there will be some fluctuation for sure. I think that the money will come in on Pereira. Pereira will probably hit -130, -135, pushing Williams to +110, +115, and then money might start coming back in on Williams. Ultimately, come fight night on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too dissimilar from where we're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, it's going to be a crazy fight, and we've got to start by looking at Khaos Williams. I actually tweeted something about him the other day. I was on UFC stats and looking at his statistics, and significant strikes landed per minute is currently sat at 15.79, and at 15.79 it's just crazy numbers. Normally when you look at a fighter like, for example, Justin Gaethje off the top of my head, he'll be in the 7.5 strikes landed per minute, and that's very high for a UFC average. But 15.79 was just really funny to see, and obviously that doesn't paint a full picture because he's only been inside the cage a total of 57 seconds. He's landed 15 punches, so that's the reason why it's at that number. You know, if he'd had a fight that got into round 2 and 3, then obviously that would be significantly lower. But just a really fun fact, to be honest. But what is serious is the striking power of Khaos Williams, the aggression. This dude has just got something else about him, and it's really strange because when you actually watch the tape on Khaos Williams and look back at the fights where he's got into round 2, he's got into round 3, he's gone to a decision, he doesn't actually look super impressive, which is really crazy to see, and I'm really interested to see what happens if this fight potentially gets stretched. I'm just really interested to see what happens when a fighter makes it out of 30 seconds inside the cage with Khaos Williams in the UFC, because that's when we're really going to see what Khaos Williams is about. Has he developed? Has he improved in those fights since he was going 3 rounds and not looking that great the longer the fight went on? But you've got to get past that initial power, and that's a huge problem. It's something that Pereira is definitely going to have to be concerned about, because the way that Khaos stormed Alex Morono on his UFC debut on short notice and put him away was super impressive, and then flatlining Abdul Razak Al Hassan in your second fight within 30 seconds is just ridiculously impressive. So Khaos Williams has definitely got something about him. He could potentially be one of those fighters that if he doesn't knock you out early, he will fade late, but we're yet to see it. And because we're yet to see it, that just proves that Williams can knock you out early. So the dude's dangerous, and from that perspective, I do get why the betting line is close. And then when you look at the stylistic differences between Pereira actually creates a stylistic firefight here, because he's a dude that'll do backflips inside the cage. He'll jump off the side of the cage, try and do the Showtime kick. He'll do Superman punches. Anything that you would ever think, oh, that's not possible to do inside the cage, Pereira's probably going to do it, and probably going to have some success doing it too. Now, the problem with Pereira doing that sort of stuff is he does gas himself out really badly. We saw that in the fight with Tristan Connolly, where that's a fight that Pereira should have really been winning, to be honest, but he did tire out because of those crazy actions, the backflips, and just all the stuff that you shouldn't be doing inside the cage if you're wanting to go 3 hard rounds. But then in his last fight against Imadaev, that fight was stunning from Pereira. There was very minimal crazy stuff in that fight. He got back down to his fundamentals. He put on a clinic against Imadaev. He just controlled the fight from start to finish. Really frustrated Imadaev as well. So that's the Michel Pereira that's really, really good. And it almost depends on what Pereira we're going to get inside the cage. If Khaos is throwing big bombs, winging big bombs, it wouldn't surprise me if Pereira just tried to have some fun with it and started doing some crazy things. And at that point, that's where the fight gets unpredictable, and that's where I believe that the betting lines are rightfully close. If Pereira comes into this fight, minds his P's and Q's, sticks down to his fundamentals, uses his jab, doesn't do anything crazy, then Pereira's the rightful favourite, and that Pereira should probably be -140, -150, maybe even potentially wider as well. So it all depends on what Pereira we get inside the cage to what fight we see. I'm personally going with the Pereira that sticks down to his fundamentals, the Pereira we saw against Imadaev. I think that fighter is going to have enjoyed that performance against Imadaev, a fight where he could really make himself look good. And I do think that he's got to take Khaos Williams' power seriously. If he doesn't, he's going to get knocked out. I don't think he wants to get knocked out. Obviously, no fighter does. But for me, I think looking at Khaos Williams' style from the eyes of Pereira, I think Pereira's going to go into this fight and just fight relatively safe, relatively calm, and just make sure he gets another win on his record and save that crazy style for another fight that might be less dangerous for him getting caught with something if he ends up off balance or does something stupid. So if that's the Pereira that turns up, I think that Pereira will land more volume than Khaos Williams. I think he'll be able to get out the way of the big shots. I think he'll be able to keep himself safe early in the fight, and the longer the fight goes on, I think Pereira will grow into it. And there's also the wrestling side of that as well. If Pereira wants to shoot on Khaos Williams and try and take him down early, tire him out, nullify that power, that knockout threat, then I think that is a good path to victory for Pereira as well. So multiple paths to victory and a sensible Pereira. Those are the reasons I'm picking Michel Pereira to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a good one at bantamweight. We've got Marlon Moraes versus Rob Font. Marlon Moraes currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Font at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value sits on this betting line, I do think the value's with the underdog in Rob Font here. I think Rob Font is a very underrated fighter, a very underappreciated fighter as well, with really good skills. So I'm not saying that he should be the favourite here. Marlon Moraes is a very solid fighter that's been at the top of the division for a long time. I just feel that this fight could potentially be really close, and because of that, the lines should be shorter as well. As for where the betting lines move, Marlon Moraes was a bigger favourite. The money's come back in on Rob Font. Not a ton of money, but just a little bit. But that brick wall does seem to be appearing for Rob Font. He tends to go down to +120, +118, +117, and then suddenly that Marlon Moraes money is coming back, pushing Font up to +125, and ultimately I think that's where the line seems to be settling. So come fight night on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet, if I'm being honest. Both fighters are improved in the wrestling and the grappling, and they're both capable wherever the fight goes, really well-rounded fighters. But in this particular fight, I don't think the wrestling and the grappling is going to play too much of a factor. You can never say never in regards to it actually happening. You know, Marlon Moraes might try and shoot in on Rob Font, or Font might try and shoot in on Moraes, but if either fighter is successful with a takedown and the fight gets to the mat, I don't think either fighter is good enough on top to control the defensive work on bottom of their opponent, and it doesn't matter which way around that is. I think if Moraes is on top, Font will be able to stand back up and vice versa. So for me, the greater body of work in this fight is probably going to be done on the feet. And again, similar to what I said with Aldo, with Marlon Moraes, he's got really good leg kicks, but he doesn't always go to them, and it's really strange to why he doesn't do that, because when he does use the low kicks, he does hurt the leg of his opponent. You look at the Henry Cejudo fight, Marlon Moraes started that fight better. He was landing low kicks on Cejudo, he was hurting him, and we've seen other examples of that as well, but that was just one that springs to mind. So with Marlon Moraes, he's got to get to those leg kicks if he wants to really give himself a good chance of winning this fight. And if he does come with a leg kick game plan, I do think he wins. But the thing is with Rob Font, and this is something that Moraes is going to have to deal with, and deal with relatively quickly before it starts getting too much for him, is for me, Rob Font's boxing. He's got some of the best hands in the division. I think he's up there with the likes of Pettis, with Cody Garbrandt, for how solid those hands from a technical perspective are. He pops that jab out, he'll double up on the jab as well, and he works everything built off that jab, which is just really beautiful to see. A good solid jab is just a really, really good weapon to have in your arsenal, because like I say, you can set so much from it. You can halt your opponent's aggression and forward movement, you can cause frustration with it as well, all whilst that volume being added up for yourself as well. So what Font does with that jab is really great, but what comes after it is great as well. He's got good combinations, he'll mix the punches to the body as well after the jab, and he's also got a really educated uppercut as well that he seems to time perfectly when his opponents are ducking their heads. And this uppercut specifically is something that Moraes is going to have to watch out for, because it's a very similar uppercut to what Jose Aldo was landing on Moraes numerous times in their fight. So for me, Rob Font's hands are really, really sharp, and they come with power as well. Especially the sniper shots straight down the middle, they do hurt, and you can just never be surprised when you see Rob Font put somebody down, because his hands are that good and he does throw them with power. Now, one thing that Font has got to be mindful of in this fight is being defensively responsible, because another big weapon of Marlon Moraes, we've talked about the low kicks, but he's also got knockout power in his head kicks as well. He's got a really nice switch lead left kick to the head. He'll also step in with a right head kick also. Whichever side he thinks there's a bigger hole, Moraes will throw it, and if it does land, we have seen him knock opponents out cold. So Rob Font has got to be defensively aware when he's attacking. His hands are really good, they're really sharp, they come with power, but he's just got to mind his P's and Q's as well, and just make sure that he's thinking from a defensive perspective, because if he's not, then I do think Moraes is going to start landing some heavy shots, grow into the fight, take the first couple of rounds, and if he doesn't finish Font, then potentially win a decision on the scorecards. But I do think Font's fight IQ is really high. I don't think he's the type of fighter that will leave himself overexposed in a fight like this and allow Marlon Moraes to get an easy knockout. I'm not saying that Moraes can't knock him out, but if Font is laid on the canvas unconscious by the end of the fight, it's going to be because he's made Marlon Moraes really work for it, and Moraes, being the experienced top fighter that he is, has been able to find that hole and find a shot on Font that's put him out. Ultimately though, I think that if this fight does go to a decision, I think the volume's a little bit of a concern from Marlon Moraes. I think Rob Font will be landing more volume. I think the way he strikes looks really nice. It'll add up in regards to the numbers and the volume, and I do think that he could potentially hurt Marlon Moraes. Both fighters have solid paths to victory here. Like I said at the start of the breakdown, it could be a really, really close fight, but I think that Font is the more likely fighter to find a finish in the fight, and I do think the volume is going to be slightly higher on Font as well. It all depends on if Moraes can get Font's legs hurt early or make him hesitant with big head kicks, but I have to go with Font here just because, like I say, he's the more likely fighter to finish, and I do like his body of work on the feet more and the volume more as well. I'm picking Rob Font to win this fight. And in the next fight in the heavyweight division, we've got Marcin Tybura versus Greg Hardy. Greg Hardy's currently the minus 120 favourite. The comeback on Tybura at plus 100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the betting line's relatively fair, to be honest. Maybe marginal value on Greg Hardy, but ultimately if this fight was a pick'em, then I think it would be unrightfully a pick'em, and if Greg Hardy was out at minus 140, minus 150, then I think that line would be way too wide. So maybe marginal value on Greg Hardy, but ultimately the line's relatively fair. As for where the betting line moves, I do expect money to come in on Greg Hardy as we get close to Fight Night on Saturday night. People just love the big, scary dude that's got huge knockout power. So Greg Hardy fits that bill, and he is popular on the betting lines. I am a little surprised he's minus 120. I thought he would be much higher, even though it would be unrightfully wider. I do think that minus 120 is a little bit of a surprise. So it actually wouldn't shock me to see Greg Hardy enter the cage on Saturday night as that minus 140, minus 150 favourite that I don't think he should be. If that's the case, then yeah, there will be some value on Marcin Tybura. As for how this fight plays out though, for me, Tybura's got to get this fight down to the mat. Greg Hardy, his striking is dangerous. He's also developing from a technical standpoint. I'll still go back to that Volkov fight. Yes, Volkov won that fight very clearly, but you did see so much development in Greg Hardy's game that he allowed himself to be relatively competitive in that fight. And for me, Volkov's one of the most technical strikers in the heavyweight division. So Tybura has got to get Hardy down, because not only is Hardy improving technically, he's also still got that raw power. Now, the other thing that Tybura could potentially do to take over this fight is try and weather a storm on the feet, but again, it's a very dangerous game to play, and I don't think Tybura has got the durability to put himself into that storm to try and weather it. Because if you can allow Hardy to unload, swing on you and empty his gas tank, and you're still there after the first round, then the fight gets much easier for you. Your movement seems to be a little bit better, you seem to be a little bit quicker, takedowns will come a little bit easier. If you take Hardy down and put him on his back while he's tired, Hardy's probably not going to get back up to his feet. You can ground him out, drain that gas tank even more, potentially finish him. If not, then that fight's going to be much easier in the third round for all the reasons I've just mentioned. And for some heavyweight fighters, that is probably an option, but like I say, I don't trust Tybura's durability enough for him to be able to take those hard punches from Hardy. We've seen Tybura put down by strikes that probably aren't as powerful as what Hardy's going to throw at, so I don't think Tybura should be trying to weather a storm. I think he should be trying to take Hardy down, and I think that's going to be difficult because, again, that's a area of Hardy's game that he's currently developing. He's not an easy fighter to take down. He's going to be much bigger and much stronger than Tybura, so if Tybura can't get him down, then it's going to be a big problem, because that storm's going to come, and I don't think Tybura's going to weather it. I personally think that's how the fight's going to play out. If I'm wrong, and if Tybura can get Hardy down early in that first round, I do think he'll be able to drain his gas tank, and in that scenario, I think Tybura will win the fight. And ultimately, this is why I think it's right that the betting lines are very close here, because if Tybura does get that first takedown and can keep Hardy down, then Tybura's probably going to switch to be a favourite in live betting, and he's probably going to go on to win the fight. Ultimately, I think Hardy keeps this fight standing. I think he puts the pressure on Tybura early, he puts that storm on him, and I think he knocks him out, so I'm picking Greg Hardy to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gillian Robertson versus Taila Santos. Taila Santos is currently the minus 115 favourite with the comeback on Robertson, the slight minus 105 underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it sits with the underdog in Gillian Robertson. It's a good stylistic matchup, but I think the style of Robertson is more likely to play out dominant in this particular spot. And as for where the betting line moves, Robertson actually opened up the plus 105 underdog. She got bet into a minus 125 favourite with a line flip. Now the lines have flipped the other way again, so there's been a lot of movement on either side, and I think it's one of those fights where people are going to be quite torn on. For that reason, I think there's going to be fluctuation. Ultimately, it wouldn't shock me to see this fight go into the fight on Saturday night as a minus 110 pick'em on either side. As for how the fight plays out though, as I've already mentioned, stylistically it's a really good fight. Predominantly we've got striker versus grappler here. I do think that Santos is more well-rounded though, and that's probably why the line's flipped. Santos has got that Muay Thai background, but she's also got okay wrestling, and she's also got good grappling as well. We saw that in the Molly McCann fight. So for me, I feel that although Santos is a striker, her wrestling and grappling is actually better than the striking of Gillian Robertson, which is her weakness, which makes Santos that better all-round fighter. The problem is, though, for Santos, is I think that Gillian Robertson's strength is greater than her strength, which should allow Robertson to be more dominant in this fight. I think whilst this fight is standing, all fights start standing, that Taila Santos is going to be getting off on good strikes on Robertson. I do think that the striking of Santos is light years ahead of Robertson, but the problem is Robertson's going to realise that, and once she gets hit a few times and realises how good Taila Santos actually is compared to her striking, I think that's only going to force Robertson to shoot takedowns more. I think Robertson's going to be able to get takedowns. She has a good completion rate, and once she gets a fight down to the mat, her control is very, very good on the mat as well. So for me, it's important that Robertson gets on top of Santos and doesn't allow Santos to take her down, which is also a possibility. But I think that Santos is going to have much more success on the feet, that she's not going to want to shoot a takedown because she'll feel that skill set difference in the striking department. Ultimately, I think Robertson's going to be the one shooting the takedowns. I think she's going to find some success with takedowns. I don't think that Santos can't defend them, but I think if Robertson's persistent enough with them, committed to them, she'll get them. And once Robertson gets on top, puts Santos on her back, I think that the round will end on the mat with Robertson in a dominant position, or Robertson could potentially submit Santos as well. And ultimately, that's where I'm leaning with Gillian Robertson in this fight, because if she does that in 2 out of the 3 rounds, then she'll win a decision should she not get a submission and should the fight go to the scorecards. And I think that outcome is more likely than Taila Santos keeping the fight vertical, winning on volume on the feet, or knocking Robertson out. I think the path to victory for Robertson is slightly greater than the path to victory for Taila Santos. For that reason, I'm picking Gillian Robertson to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Anthony Pettis versus Alex Morono. Anthony Pettis is currently the -230 favourite. The comeback on Morono at +190 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the line is quite fair, if I'm being honest. There's obviously a lot of red flags and question marks around Anthony Pettis, but I think the UFC have matched him up in a fight here where he should be able to go in there and look good without having too many difficulties. You know, it's not easy to run over Moreno, but I do think it's a good fight for Pettis, and -230 does make sense. As for where the betting line moves, I'd imagine there's going to be a lot of people on Morono here at plus money just because of those big question marks and red flags with Pettis. Obviously declining, coming to the end of his career. He hasn't looked good in quite a while. So I do think that there's going to be more people at the betting window looking to get the tickets on Morono at +190 opposed to Pettis at -230. For that reason, I do think the lines do shorten up a little bit. We might see Pettis enter this fight -200, maybe -190 come fight night on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, I think Anthony Pettis has got more paths to victory here. I think he's going to be absolutely happy to stand and strike with Morono. Morono did surprise a few people against Reese McKee in his last fight, shooting for takedowns, which he doesn't really look to implement wrestling into the game plan. But I don't think he can do that against Pettis, because I don't think he'll be able to get Pettis down. And if he does, I think Pettis' guard game is more than good enough to cause Morono problems, potentially even submit him. So I do think that Morono's going to try and keep this fight on the feet. Definitely, I'd be shocked if he shot takedowns in this fight. But from the Pettis perspective, I definitely think Pettis could implement takedowns in this fight. I think he'll have success on the feet regardless. I think he's a better striker. But if he really wanted to mix it up with Morono, then takedowns wouldn't shock me. And I actually think that he'd have some success on top of Morono. He'd have some control time. It would limit the liability of him getting knocked out on the feet. Obviously, like I say, Pettis hasn't looked good in a long time. But I think Pettis will look fine on the feet. I think he can also use his wrestling and his jiu-jitsu to beat Morono should he need to. Should Morono hit him with a couple of hard strikes that Pettis doesn't seem to like. Ultimately, I don't think Pettis can compete with the top of the division anymore. But against guys like Morono, and I don't mean any disrespect to Morono when I say that, he's just not a top 5, top 10, top 15 fighter. I do think that Pettis in these types of fights has still got enough left in him to win the fight and win the fight comfortably as well. I think we'll see that on Saturday night. I think we'll see Pettis look relatively comfortable against Morono. If Morono lands something hard on him and puts him out, that wouldn't shock me either. But I do think that Pettis has got enough at this point to be beating the guys outside the top 15 ranked fighters inside the UFC. Multiple paths to victory as well. For those reasons, I'm picking Anthony Pettis to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Pannie Kianzad versus Sijara Eubanks. Sijara Eubanks is currently the minus 160 favourite. The comeback on Kianzad at plus 140 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that it sits with the underdog in Pannie Kianzad at plus 140. I understand why Eubanks is the favourite, but I do think that the line has gone a little bit too wide. If it was Sijara Eubanks sitting at minus 125, minus 130, with Kianzad roughly around plus 110, then I think that betting line would make much more sense. But at plus 140, I do think there's value on Pannie Kianzad. And as for where the betting lines move, I do think we're going to see some minor fluctuation here, but ultimately, with the money that comes in on Eubanks compared to the money that comes in on Kianzad, I don't think there's going to be enough action in this fight and on either side to really force the lines to move too far from where we're at right about now. So I do think that we're going to see Sijara Eubanks come into this fight minus 160, minus 150 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how the fight plays out, I think that the developments of Pannie Kianzad are really, really nice to see. I bet her in her last fight against Betch Kohea at, I think it was minus 120 or minus 125, and she looked fantastic in that fight. Again, her striking is coming on fight by fight. She's got nice straight punches, she's got decent volume. And listen, Sijara Eubanks is a good fighter as well. From a striking perspective, she'll be able to hang. She throws with more power than Kianzad, more hooks as well, will mix into the body a little bit more, and I think that's the difference in the hands. As for the kicks, I think Kianzad will use potentially more kicks than what Sijara Eubanks will, but again, I think the striking is going to be quite close on the feet. With the developments of Kianzad, I'd maybe give her the edge, but where Eubanks is really going to have advantages here is in the wrestling and the grappling. When Eubanks can get on top of her opponent, she does look like she's got a really good level of control topside. And the thing is with Kianzad, she slipped against Betch Kohea and Kohea got on top of her, and it actually took her a little while to get back up to her feet. At that point, I was concerned that she was about to give a round up because of that. So she did seem to lay on her back a little bit, didn't really show too much urgency in a fight that she was dominating on the feet. So Kianzad at that point should have been desperate to get back up, and she just didn't. It does give me some concerns for her in this fight, because if Eubanks does take her down, then I'm not sure that Kianzad will be able to get up as easily against Eubanks as what she did against Betch Kohea, and Eubanks is a better topside grappler than Kohea. So for me, that's where Eubanks has the biggest path to victory. The only question mark on that is we have seen Eubanks slow down in previous fights. Obviously, when Eubanks fought Kohea, Kohea was working her to the body. It did tire her out. It stopped Eubanks being able to look for takedowns and ultimately allowed Kohea to take over that fight and beat Eubanks, which in my opinion was a very good victory for Kohea. I was quite surprised with the outcome. So that's an option for Kianzad to work the body early and make Eubanks work even if she takes her down. But ultimately, I think that Eubanks has got so much an advantage on the mat that if she can get the fight there, it could look relatively easy for her, and that minus 160 might look like it should have been minus 200. I think Eubanks is the slightly more well-rounded fighter. I think a style, if she goes for the takedown, is probably going to favour the fight against the style of Kianzad. I think Kianzad's going to have problems off her back should it go there. I think it does. I'm picking Sijara Eubanks to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Carl Roberson versus Dalcha Lungiambula. Carl Roberson's currently the minus 255 favourite. The comeback on Lungiambula at plus 215 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think it's absolutely siding with Dalcha Lungiambula here at plus 215. I understand why he's the underdog in this fight, in this spot, but plus 215 is just way too wide. So for me, the value sits with the underdog. As for where the betting lines move, I can only imagine that the money is going to come back in on Lungiambula, but I think if it does come in drastically and we see Lungiambula hit the plus 185, plus 180, plus 175 range, then I do think we'll see Roberson money coming back out. Ultimately, I think Lungiambula is going to probably come into this fight on Saturday night just shorter than a plus 200 underdog. And as for how this fight plays out, stylistically for me, I do think that this fight should be a striker versus wrestler scenario, with Roberson being the striker, Lungiambula being the wrestler. Now, that's not typically Lungiambula's game. You know, he's not just a wrestler, he does like to come forward, he has good forward movement, he's aggressive as well, he'll look to land big punches, But in this fight against an ex-kickboxer in Carl Roberson, if Lungiambula tries going strike for strike, I don't think he's going to be too successful. I think Roberson will land on him, land frequently on him, hurt him up and down the body with kicks, with punches, mixing up between head, body and legs as well. I think that Lungiambula has to go into this fight with that wrestling and grappling mindset, and he could win the fight that way. He could push Roberson back to the cage. I think Lungiambula's going to be much stronger than Roberson. I think he'll be able to lift him up, put him on his back. Roberson is susceptible to being taken down, and he can look stuck on bottom at times as well. And I think if Lungiambula can just grind him up against the cage, just not allow any space at all and just waste minutes on the clock by clinching against the cage and then taking him down momentarily, Roberson might stand back up. Lungiambula should keep putting that pressure on him and rinse and repeat with the takedowns. I think Lungiambula can win a very ugly, dirty decision that way in this fight, or potentially even knock Roberson out late if he tires out. It's out in space where Lungiambula's going to have real problems in this fight, because technically Roberson is just a better striker than Lungiambula. He's quicker, he'll land more volume, he'll put together more combinations. So Lungiambula's got to try and close the distance, make it ugly. Roberson has got to do completely the opposite, keep it out in space and just piece Lungiambula up. Ultimately, with the forward pressure of Lungiambula, I just don't see him allowing that sort of space in this fight. It's not his style. He's a fighter that is always looking to come forward and be aggressive and really try to intimidate his opponent. So I don't see Lungiambula allowing the space. I do think he tries to close the distance at all times, and for that reason, that's why I'm going to favour Lungiambula as the underdog in this fight. I think it's possible for him to get a hold of Carl Roberson, push him against the cage, take him down, or just grind him out and waste minutes on the clock. Initially, when I started breaking this fight down, I was leaning towards Roberson because of the striking skill set differences from a technical perspective, but I do think that the path to victory for Lungiambula is right there for him should he take it. So for those reasons, I'm picking Dalcha Lungiambula to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Durden Win versus Antonio Arroyo. Antonio Arroyo is currently the -155 favourite. The comeback on Win at +135 is the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the betting line is quite fair, if I'm being honest. Maybe slight value on the favourite in Arroyo, but ultimately it's where I expected the betting line to be sat at. As for where the betting line moves, I do think we're going to see some fluctuation. I think if Arroyo gets up to -160, -165, potentially even -170, I think at that point there'll be enough value on Durden Win for people to back him in this fight. And I think at around that -165, -170 line would be the brick wall for Arroyo, where the money would come back in on the other side. Ultimately on Saturday, come fight night, I think that both of these fighters are going to step inside the cage roughly where their odds are sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out, we've definitely got striker versus wrestler here. Antonio Arroyo being the striker and Durden Win being the wrestler. Now, Antonio Arroyo is a very aggressive striker, predominantly likes to use kicks. He's got really hard, fast, powerful kicks. And to be honest with you, with the height advantage that he's got, I think he's going to have a lot of success. Arroyo stands at 6'3", with Durden Win at 5'6", so that's a 9-inch height advantage. Weirdly, the reach is only 3 inches for Arroyo, so the reach isn't too dissimilar, but the height advantage is enough to give Arroyo a lot of success in this fight, and I think Win's going to have problems as well. Now, you could argue that the hips are going to be at a perfect height for Win to shoot a takedown, get under the hips and take Arroyo down, but I think that's going to be easier said than done, because it's 6'3", 9-inch difference. I think Win is going to have trouble actually putting Arroyo on his back. You tend to find that when one fighter is ridiculously longer than the other, the fighter that's longer is harder to take down, because they're going to be able to post a leg or post an arm and keep themselves upright and just constantly make the wrestler work. And I think that's going to be the problem for Win, because Win for me can't go strike for strike with Arroyo. He could close the distance and try to land inside the pocket, but I don't think it's going to be difficult for Arroyo just to close that gap even more. If it gets into boxing range, tie up with Win, exit, push away and get back into space. And for me, if Win is shooting takedowns and Ahoyo is keeping balanced or staying on his feet or being able to work back up to his feet straight away, then that's going to tire Win out, having to constantly work. And the longer the fight goes on in that respect, I think the easier it becomes for Ahoyo. But ultimately, I think Win might end up getting a little bit frozen in this fight. If these kicks are coming out from range, on the outside from Ahoyo and hitting him hard to the legs, to the body, to the head, even if he's blocking the head kicks, it's still going to be rattling him for sure with the power that Ahoyo has in his kicks. I think Win could end up becoming a little bit lost in this fight and wondering what he has to do next to get inside and to try and shoot a takedown. And if the takedowns aren't working, then that could break him mentally inside the fight just a little bit, enough for Ahoyo to start really taking over. I just think it's a difficult fight for Win, not from a stylistic perspective, but just because of his height, it's such a disadvantage. And because Ahoyo is a kicker and he can do it from the outside, and the kicks will come powerful enough at Win, and the fact that Win is probably going to have a really tough time in putting Ahoyo on his back and keeping him there and getting top control time, I have to favour Ahoyo here. For those reasons, I'm picking Antonio Ahoyo to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the newcomer Drako Rodriguez versus Aiemann Zahabi. Rodriguez is currently the -190 favourite. The comeback on Zahabi at +165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, again, I do think that the betting line is relatively fair. I think if we saw Drako Rodriguez up at -220, -225, then I think that the value probably would be on Zahabi at that point. But ultimately, where the lines are open do make complete sense. As for where the betting lines move, I do anticipate a lot of people potentially fading Aiemann Zahabi in this fight just because of how he's looked in the UFC. He came with hype, being the brother of Firas Zahabi at TriStar, and what has actually transpired inside the cage, and he's not looked too great in his opening 3 fights. I do think that people are going to be fading Zahabi, so I think the money's going to come in on Drako Rodriguez. I think we're going to see him at that -220, -225 line that I think would be a little too wide come fight night on Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, Drako Rodriguez looks like a really exciting fighter. He's quick, he's dynamic, he's exciting. He'll look to put the pressure on when he can, always look to come forwards. He's got good kicks, good striking, will put combinations together. And if the fight hits the mat, he's got good jiu-jitsu as well. So he's got a really good all-round style, and a style that I think could potentially cause a lot of problems for Aiemann Zahabi. Now you look at Zahabi. Zahabi is predominantly a striker. He very rarely will look to take an opponent down, but I also don't think he's completely out of his element on the mat either. But he definitely prefers to stay on the feet, put combinations together, and just try and outpoint his opponents. Now, the problem with Zahabi, the problem that he's had is he just hasn't looked good in the UFC. He hasn't really been able to get much off. He did win his UFC debut against Aldo Vera back in 2017, but even that wasn't a convincing win for him. Sure, he got the unanimous decision, but a couple of those rounds could have gone either way. Then he came in against Ricardo Ramos. He looked okay in that fight, to be fair, until the 3rd round where Ramos landed that spin back elbow, knocked him out. And then he came back in against Vince Morales a couple of years after that. So he took a couple of years off, and he just didn't look great in that fight at all. He couldn't get anything going. He looked like he was very gun-shy, freezing up, and ultimately just allowed Vince Morales to come to him, and that's why he lost the decision. So, that was a year ago. Has there been developments over this year? Potentially. He is still in a good gym. His brother is one of the best coaches in the world in mixed martial arts, so the developments could be there, but ultimately looking at the type of speed and pressure that Drako Rodriguez has got, I do think that Rodriguez is going to be the more exciting, the more dynamic fighter, the one that's landing more volume, not discriminating between the head, body and legs as well. And if this fight hits the mat, then I trust Drako Rodriguez on the mat as well. So for me, I think it's a difficult fight for Aiemann Zahabi. And I'm not saying that Zahabi can't win this fight. He could find a way to win it. But from what I've seen on tape, Drako Rodriguez looks like the more difficult fighter to deal with inside the cage. He looks more confident in his skill set and his abilities as well. And I think that he's going to be able to have a lot of success in that fight for those reasons. So for those reasons, I'm picking Draco Rodriguez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got two newcomers, both from Dana White's Contender Series. We've got Tafon Chukwi versus Jamie Pickett. Tafon Chukwi is currently the minus 300 favourite. The comeback on Pickett at plus 250 as the underdog. As for where the value sits on this betting line, I do think the value's with Pickett at plus 250. I think the betting line's too wide. The fight could be relatively close and the odds just don't reflect that. As for where the betting lines move, I think Chukwi might have hit his brick wall here at minus 300. If he got up to minus 350, minus 370, I just think that would be absolutely insane. I think at the current betting lines, I think there's going to be more people betting Pickett at plus 250 than Chukwi at minus 300. But having said that, there could be people throwing Chukwi in parlays at minus 300. I think that's very risky as well, if I'm being honest. But ultimately, come fight night on Saturday night, there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation. But I think that the fighters are going to go in roughly where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out, so Chukwi, I get it, he's athletic, he's got power, he'll throw in short combinations. But when these short combinations land, they hit hard. He doesn't have much volume though, and this is what worries me a little bit, because Pickett, that is one thing he has. He will come forward, he will look to land body kicks, he'll look to land combinations. His movement is a little bit better as well, sliding in and out of range and laterally. So I think from a movement and speed perspective, I think Pickett has got advantages in this fight. Pickett's just got to be careful that when he strikes, he doesn't stay in the pocket for too long, looking to take that picture, as we say, after he's landed himself, because the counter of Chukwi will be there. It will be there in multiple punches, and he does have power in these punches as well that could definitely hurt Pickett and knock him out cold. Chukwi has that fight-ending ability, which makes him very dangerous in this fight, and ultimately, I think that's what's baked into the betting line. But from a volume perspective, movement perspective, and just being able to land more strikes, I feel genuinely that if Pickett doesn't get knocked out here, he could win a decision going down the stretch. Chukwi has good cardio, so I don't think he's going to be gassing when he gets into the third round enough for Pickett to be able to put a finish on him. But like I say, I think if Chukwi doesn't knock him out, he's going to have problems going down the stretch, because if it does hit the scorecards, I think Pickett will have landed more strikes, looked better in regards to his movement, and therefore being favoured by the judges. So for those reasons, I'm actually going to pick the underdog here. I'm picking Jamie Pickett to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight that should have gone down 2 weeks ago. We've got Jimmy Flick versus Cody Durden. Jimmy Flick's currently the minus 150 favourite. The comeback on Durden at plus 130 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I said the same thing the last time I broke this fight down a couple of weeks ago. I do think the value sits with Jimmy Flick at minus 150. I think that the line could potentially be a little bit wider, but I think if it got to the point where Jimmy Flick was minus 180, minus 190, then the value would completely flip on Cody Durden. So for me, the value right now sits with Jimmy Flick at minus 150. As for where the betting line moves, it's a little bit of a strange one, because 2 weeks ago, Jimmy Flick was ready to close at around minus 160, minus 165, and when the betting odds were released again for this weekend, 2 weeks later, Jimmy Flick was sitting at minus 130, minus 135, and he has just recently come back up to minus 150. So the lines now are shorter than what they were before, and it's actually Cody Durden that pulled out of that last fight as well, which again, it just doesn't make any sense why the betting line was much closer this time around. Ultimately, though, I do think that there's going to be some fluctuation. There are people that like Cody Durden at plus money, and listen, I like Cody Durden as a fighter, so I do understand why people are taking that plus money, but there's going to be a bit of fluctuation. I do think as we get to the fight on Saturday night, though, that there is going to be a slow stream of money coming back in on Jimmy Flick, and I think he will close at that minus 160, minus 165 range. But as for how this fight plays out, again, it's the second time I'm breaking this down, so I'll run over the things that I said last time around. I think that this fight is going to be won and lost with what happens on the mat, opposed to what happens on the feet. I think both fighters are more comfortable in the wrestling and the grappling, even though they can both strike as well. On the feet, it could be relatively close. If this is a 15-minute kickboxing match, then I do think that the fight is going to be very, very close. If somebody doesn't get knocked out, it's going to be close on the judges' scorecards. But ultimately, I just see takedowns from either side, grappling on either side. And I feel that in that department, even though Cody Durden is solid, he's a good wrestler, he's got good grappling, good control topside, I feel that Flick is just better in every position in that wrestling and in that grappling department. I think that Flick on the mat is a nightmare on top. He's submission hunting constantly. He's not even submission over position either. He's just really good at getting to the positions where he can start looking to try and submit you. If an arm triangle isn't working, he'll let go of it. He'll look to try and take you back and choke you out. If that's not working, he'll try and flip that into a triangle. He'll just fire everything at you. Now, he's better on top for sure, but he can also fight on bottom too. He can also look for the triangles, look for the arm bars, look for any spaces to sweep and reverse. I think Jimmy Flick's a nightmare on the mat, and as good as Cody Durden is, I think Jimmy Flick will stifle him down there. And I think if this fight is won and lost on the mat, I think Cody Durden is going to fall behind on the scorecards. I think he is going to struggle a little bit. I trust Jimmy Flick on his back more than what I trust Durden on his back. And if Flick's on top, I think he's just going to be a big problem for Durden. So for those reasons, with the fight, in my opinion, being won and lost on the mat, I have to favour Jimmy Flick. I'm picking Jimmy Flick to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this podcast, the final breakdown of 2020, we close with Rick Glenn versus Carlton minus. Rick Glenn's currently the minus 325 favourite. The comeback on minus at plus 265 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do feel the value sits with the underdog in Carlton minus. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely understand why Rick Glenn's the favourite in this fight, rightfully the favourite in this fight, but at minus 325, I definitely have some issues in regards to the layoff and what Rick Glenn's been up to, where he's been training, and we'll get into that soon. But there's definitely some concerns there to make me think that minus 325 on Rick Glenn holds no value, and therefore the value flips onto the underdog in Carlton minus. As for where the betting line moves though, I do think we're going to see money coming in on minus. It has been happening for the last 24 to 48 hours. Only a slow, steady stream though. I don't think there's going to be too many people rushing to bet Carlton minus, because I do think he's in a fight here where he could potentially be over his head. So rushing to the betting window to bet him, I don't think is going to be a popular thing, but I do think we see a slow, steady stream of money coming in, and we might see Rick Glenn drop below the minus 300 range before the fight starts on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, like I say, I've got some question marks and there's some red flags with Rick Glenn for sure. Obviously, he's taken 2 years off, and you wonder what he's been doing in that 2 years. You know, has he been consistently working at Team Alpha Male, improving his game, getting better? And it actually turns out that he's taken a job as a plumber and he's no longer training at Team Alpha Male. I mean, he's still training mixed martial arts, but he's not at that gym anymore. And it does make you wonder why he left. Did he leave because he was prioritising his job as a plumber over being a mixed martial artist, a professional fighter? So there's definitely some question marks there now. Luckily for Rick Glenn, he's not fighting an absolute killer in this fight. I do think he's got a fighter that is still relatively raw and green themselves, and that he should be able to win this fight in multiple different areas regardless of where the fight goes. It's going to be really interesting to see how Rick Glenn looks in this fight. Carlton minus isn't going to be a fighter that you're going to roll over very easily, so Rick Glenn's definitely going to have to work. I think minus is going to come in there. He's going to try and strike with Glenn. If it doesn't work for him, I think he might start looking for takedowns, but I think that wherever this fight goes, it could be an issue for minus, because if this is the same Rick Glenn as we saw last time, then I think Rick Glenn's striking is going to be a little bit better than minus's. I think his wrestling is going to be better, topside grappling is going to be better, and I think minus could end up being put in a very rough spot in this fight. But if Rick Glenn isn't the same fighter that what he was 2 years ago, if the fact that he has been working as a plumber and he hasn't been training around the guys he's usually been training against, and he's looking a little older inside the cage, a little slower inside the cage, and he's maybe lost a step or two, then the youthful energy of minus could really cause problems in this fight. And that's where I think that the betting line should be much shorter than where it is now, because there is a chance of that scenario happening, and if that does happen, then minus could potentially end up looking great at a plus 265 underdog. The problem is I can't make assumptions on things that I haven't seen yet, so because I'm looking at Rick Glenn as what he was against Kevin Aguilar and what he was against Gavin Tucker and Dennis Bermudez, I do have to favour him in this fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rick Glenn to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, for the final time in 2020, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. Remember, You can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and as a long-term winning gambler over the last 4 years, that will likely come good for you. And we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot, fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. Just hop onto MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and from all the team at MMA Play 365, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.